You know, Michael Jordan has all the moves, you know. Everybody concentrates on his great moves, but look at the simple things. Just a little easy pump fake, lines it up, gets himself square, and goes up in perfect form. That's what makes him the great player. It's not the flashy things. It's the little simple things that he does. It's his fundamental base combined with his skill base that makes him the greatest player to ever play.
And you say that without hesitation.
Without hesitation.
In this modern day, most people view Michael Jordan as the greatest basketball player of all time. It basically doesn't matter where the poll is taken, whether it's amongst media members, current NBA players, or general basketball fans. MJ always wins the polls for the title of the greatest player of all time. Many Jordan fans see that as a claim that MJ earned, thanks to his tremendous success, and thanks to his 6 championships and 6 finals MVPs. But the thing is, one could argue that MJ received that title because of something else entirely. The reason being is that MJ was called the GOAT long before he won all of those rings. As you saw in the clip earlier, Isaiah Thomas, and just about everyone else alongside of him, was calling Michael Jordan the greatest player of all time in 1998. But years earlier, during halftime of a 1993 NBA Finals game, Magic Johnson said that Jordan was the greatest player in league history.
Do you feel that Michael is the best ever?
I think so. I think he's not only the best basketball player, but probably the greatest athlete that's ever played any sport. Michael Jordan is not only the best basketball player, but he's the most exciting basketball player to ever play. We only dream about doing things that he can do, and that being Isaiah and myself.
Now understand just how astonishing this claim was. Magic Johnson was a 5-time NBA champion who was saying this about a 2-time champion player, who had fewer All-Star selections and fewer All-NBA selections than Magic did at this point in his career. Whatever Michael had that made him so special, apparently it was enough for his fellow greats to look past his fewer accolades, fewer championships, and fewer career statistics. But what's crazy is that it goes even further back than that. Michael's individual greatness was understood even in the 1980s, as his competition would frequently tell you that he was a cut above the rest. This interview is from Isaiah Thomas in June of 1989. Take a listen.
Let me ask you about different players in the league, and you just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Michael Jordan. The best. You know, Magic Johnson is my friend, Irvin. Absolutely. He's by far one of the best to ever pick up a basketball. But I tell you, this dude there, yeah. But this guy, you can't stop him. His skills are so unbelievable in terms of his quickness, his strength, his jumping ability, his touch, and also his knowledge and understanding for the game. He by far, you know, is the best I've ever seen. And Irvin's my boy, but, you know, Air, yeah. It's something else. Yeah. He real sweet. Yeah. I mean, the dude, you see what he be doing? Yeah.
Once again, I want you to understand the context of this interview. When Isaiah made this claim that MJ was the best of the best, he was saying this after his Pistons had just eliminated Jordan and the Bulls from the playoffs for the 2nd straight season. Jordan hadn't yet won a championship. He hadn't even reached a conference finals yet, and he only had 1 league MVP on his resume. Yet Isaiah was saying that he was better than the 5-time champion Magic Johnson, the 3-time champion Larry Bird, and the 6-time champion Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. MJ was so dominant and so transcendent from simply the eye test perspective that Isaiah vaulted him way above the other legends, even with their far more proven track records. Now you would think that this was the furthest back in time that Jordan's GOAT claims go, but it was actually well before this interview with Isaiah. In 1984, before Michael Jordan ever played a single game in the NBA, he was a member of Team USA, who was led by the Hall of Fame coach Bobby Knight. Jordan and his collegiate teammates dominated a team of NBA All-Stars, with guys like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Clyde Drexler, and Isaiah Thomas on the roster. Bob Knight had plenty of time that summer to witness Jordan's greatness and his drive on full display. And here's what he had to say about the young phenom.
The kid is just an absolutely great kid. If I were going to pick the 3 or 4 best athletes I've ever seen play basketball, he'd be one of them. I think he's the best athlete I've ever seen play basketball, bar none. If I were going to pick people with the best ability I'd ever seen play the game, he'd be one of them. If I were going to pick the best competitors that I'd ever seen play, he'd be one of them. So in the categories of competitiveness, ability, skill, and then athletic ability, he's the best athlete, he's one of the best competitors, he's one of the most skilled players. And that, to me, makes him the best basketball player that I've ever seen play.
Again, MJ hadn't even played a single minute of a professional basketball game, and Knight was making the claim that this 21-year-old player was the greatest basketball player that he had ever seen. And he was right. He had seen Magic, Bird, Kareem, Julius Erving, Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, Bill Russell, and many others. Yet one of the greatest coaches in the history of the game could tell that Jordan was the GOAT before he even put on a Bulls uniform for the very first time. That is the very definition of a transcendent talent. Honestly, in the past couple of years, a lot of people have told me to hold off on the excitement of some young players, and that it was, quote, too early to know if a player was really going to be an all-time great. Guys like Victor Wembanyama and Anthony Edwards have earned tremendous hype at such a young age. And although people are saying that we need to pump the brakes, it's worth looking at Michael Jordan's early career and realize that sometimes you can just tell who the best is, even before the accolades and the titles start to pile up. But on the other hand, maybe it was just an MJ thing, seeing how he's simply the best of the very best. When I say that Michael Jordan was one of the greatest shot blockers in the history of the game, what is your reaction? Do you think it's absurd that I would even suggest it? After all, he only averaged what seems like a measly 0.8 blocks per game throughout his career. Well, I would argue that this stat is where the misconception comes in. Usually, the guys who we consider as the greatest shot blockers in NBA history are actually the centers. You know, the guys who are 7 feet tall and hang out around the basket. Their specific job is to protect the rim, hovering within 15 feet of the basket where the majority of shots are attempted. Naturally, it only makes sense that centers would accumulate most of the blocks. But that's the thing, MJ didn't play at center, he was a guard. Between guards, forwards, and centers, guards are the ones who generally average the fewest block shots per game, and there's several reasons for this. For one, guards are typically shorter players with less length. Second, guards' general territory is the perimeter, and a jump shot is more difficult to block than a shot inside of 15 feet, because jump shots are ideally attempted when there is space between the offensive player and the defensive player. So with that being said, MJ's career average of 0.8 blocks per game wasn't simply mediocre, but it was in fact quite excellent. In fact, among guards, during the time they played specifically at that position, MJ has the highest blocks per game average in NBA history. He also has the highest single season blocks per game average by a guard, which was 1.6, which he got in 1988. The previous season, he averaged 1.5, which was the 4th highest at the position of all time. MJ was able to achieve these numbers thanks to several incredible traits that most basketball players don't possess. For one, he was an incredible leaper who had one of the highest vertical leaps in basketball history. Second, he had remarkable intuition. His defensive IQ was off the charts, and he often caused a lot of disruptions to offensive players by either trapping them as the help defender or by sneaking up on them on the weak side when they least expected it. This on-court awareness and impeccable sense of timing enabled him to block shots of much bigger players that he theoretically should have no business blocking. The third aspect was Jordan's insane quickness and speed. It's one thing to make the proper read as a defensive player, but it's another thing entirely to have the quickness and the athleticism to be able to execute that block. That was something that Jordan did with precision and frequency, especially in his early 20s when his quickness was at its peak. I feel like some of you still might be overlooking Jordan's immense greatness as a shot blocker, so let me share an eye-opening stat. Getting 4 blocks in a single game is a tough thing to do. Generally speaking, that's a great night of rim protection, even for the greatest rim protectors the game has to offer. For goodness sake, the NBA's current leader in blocked shots is Victor Wembanyama, and he's 7'5" and averaging roughly 3.5 per game. Now, as far as Michael Jordan, he had 26 games in his career where he had at least 4 blocked shots. To give you some perspective on just how impressive that is, consider how MJ has more of those games than the combined totals of LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Magic Johnson, and both of his sons. Also consider how most of those players are significantly taller than Jordan as well, and played nearly 5,000 games combined compared to Jordan's 1,000. Simply put, Jordan is easily one of the greatest shot blockers in the history of basketball, when you consider the context of the positions and the responsibilities. Personally, I'm tired of hearing certain fan bases try to belittle Jordan's all-around abilities, saying things like he was only a scorer, when in reality, he was averaging roughly a triple-double when he played point guard in 1989. He was one of the greatest pickpockets in NBA history, and yes, he was one of the greatest shot blockers that the game of basketball has ever seen. So I'm not gonna lie, I didn't want to make a video about this topic, but then a ton of viewers asked me to respond, and my editor said he wanted to see the response as well. I personally felt that it was so dumb that it wasn't worth my time. But alas, I'm a man of the people and you guys have spoken. Many of you probably aren't aware of this massive trend that started recently on TikTok. I personally don't use TikTok because I value the few brain cells that I already have. But this trend caught on so much that it's now showing up on social media and here on YouTube. Young fans are saying two things. One, quote, "We're done with the 90s," implying that the product was so bad that they're not even acknowledging it anymore. And two, Michael Jordan didn't have a left hand. Yeah, you heard me correctly on that one. Usually, this "we're done with the 90s" trend involves posting some lowlights of that era. This includes bad passes, sloppy handles, poor shot selection, and so on. Most of what I've seen is just plain and simple bad defense. And to that I say, okay, so what? Basketball is an imperfect sport. I don't care who your favorite player is. I promise you that they've had moments where they looked like an amateur. Everyone has highlights and lowlights. There will always be great defense and terrible defense within the league. How it's presented can influence people, but ultimately, a simple highlight or lowlight reel doesn't tell you the whole story. Even a bench-warming role player like Byron Scott has highlight compilations on YouTube. And if you are not a basketball fan and you watch those highlight compilations without proper context, you would think he belongs in the GOAT conversation. Listen, if you're done with the 90s simply because of the lackluster basketball you saw in some agenda-driven lowlights, then let me present to you the evolved defense and athleticism of the modern game. Please enjoy. So, I guess we're done with the modern game too. A lot of people are, and they tell me all the time in the comments. Listen, the point of this video isn't to slander the modern league out of revenge, but rather it's to make the point that every era has its highs and lows. Although I fully recognize that 90s players don't generally shoot the basketball as well from the perimeter, I also recognize that modern players are not as good in the post as they were in the 90s. Every era has its points of emphasis, and naturally, as a result, it also has its own strengths and weaknesses. Plain and simple, this whole trend is just a case of confirmation bias. Every player and era has its not so glamorous moments, but certain fans choose to hyper-focus on those moments, because in their minds, the best way to validate their favorite players is to invalidate the competition. LeBron beats out Jordan if MJ played in a weak era. KD is better than Bird if Larry was a plumber who played against plumbers. And Steph Curry is a GOAT candidate if you eliminate everyone who played before the year 2000. So yeah, if you're done with the 90s based on some lowlights, well then you might as well be done with the game of basketball. Now, as far as Jordan not having a left hand, Jordan had one of the greatest layup packages ever, right-handed or left-handed. For me, he's right there with Kyrie Irving for the best layup package of all time. Don't just take my word for it though, let's check the tape. Here's MJ finishing with his left over Hakeem Olajuwon of all people. Here's MJ with a series of left-handed reverse layups. Here's Jordan driving left, dribbling left, finishing left. More driving left, dribbling left, finishing left. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and about 1,000 more times after that. Hell, one of Michael Jordan's most iconic plays was him finishing with his left hand. By the way, this was Game 2 of the 1991 NBA Finals, and this was his 13th straight field goal without a miss, and 3 of those 13 shots were with his left. There's literally entire compilation videos online of MJ going to work with his left. So what's the next stupid thing TikTok is going to say? That MJ couldn't jump? Y'all have a nice day. Michael Jordan's career almost ended before it started. The year is 1984, and there's this new kid in Chicago that has the city abuzz. They knew him as the rookie they were hoping would be the future of the franchise, but we know him today as the GOAT and the face of professional basketball. But on the evening of October 26th, over 35 years ago, his legacy almost ended before it started. The Bulls were playing their first regular season game of the year. Early in the game, Jordan went up for his first official NBA dunk attempt, and the play ended extremely ugly. As you can see by the way the play unfolds, the defender's leg is caught underneath him, resulting in an awkward and painful landing. Fortunately, after a few moments, Jordan was okay and continued to play in the game. But if the angle had just been slightly different on the landing, it could have resulted in a broken shooting arm or even damage to his neck. Obviously, despite the terrible experience on his first dunk attempt, Jordan managed a few successful dunks in his career after that night. Today, I have a story from the legendary Michael Jordan that he tells about himself and about his teammate center, Luke Longley. Take a listen.
In '98, we were playing the Utah Jazz. In Utah Jazz, Scottie Pippen was out, and we knew we just played Utah in the finals the year before. So every game we play against Utah is a message. You want to send a message. I go to Luke at the beginning of the game. I say, look, you have to establish yourself inside. You have to dominate. We're gonna come to you early. You're really gonna have to set the tone for us because we don't have Scottie. It's me and Dennis and you. So he understood that. He knew the importance of that. The first quarter ends. Luke has 12 points, 4 blocks, and 4 rebounds. And I go to Luke. I say, that's how you play, man. You do that, we dominate. We up by 16. We're killing them in their building. At the end of the game, Luke had 12 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 blocks. We're winning by 16, we lose by 15. And I just chuckled and I just looked at Luke and I said, you know what, Luke? That is the last time I'm gonna give you a compliment in the middle of the game.
Now I gotta cut the interview short because it goes on for quite a while, and I want to keep this video moving. But you should know that this interview was actually pretty wholesome by the end of it, as MJ talks about the things he taught Luke and the things that Luke taught him. But we know how the internet works, and the part that went viral was where MJ was seemingly roasting his teammate for completely disappearing after the first quarter. But just how accurate is this story? Well, to get an answer for that, let's first look at MJ's clues and try to figure out which game he was talking about. According to Michael, this game was against the Utah Jazz. He said the game was played in 1998, and it was the season after they had just defeated the Jazz in the NBA Finals for the first time. He said that it was in their building, meaning Utah, and he said that Scottie Pippen was unable to play that night, presumably because of his back injury. Well, right out of the gates, I gotta get on MJ for an incorrect detail in this story. During the entirety of the Bulls' second three-peat, where Michael Jordan and Luke Longley were teammates, there was never a single game where Scottie Pippen didn't also play. I checked their regular season games, their finals games, and even the preseason. And again, Scottie played on every single night against Utah when Michael Jordan and Luke Longley were teammates. So at least from that perspective, MJ is inaccurate with this story. Now, MJ did say that it was in Utah in 1998 and heavily implied that it was during the regular season, since he referred to it as a statement game and a measuring stick game, which are typically only used to describe regular season matchups. Well, during the 97 to 98 regular season, the Bulls and Jazz only played against each other twice. And since they were in separate conferences, only one of those games were played in Utah, which tells me that I found the game that MJ was talking about. It was on February 4th, 1998, in a highly anticipated matchup between the two previous finals participants. The Bulls had a 34-14 record, which was the best in the Eastern Conference, while the Jazz had a 30-15 record, which had them sitting at 5th in the West. Many people expected this to be a preview for the upcoming NBA Finals in June, but there was even more drama off the court. Just earlier that morning, an article dropped in the Chicago Tribune, where Bulls general manager Jerry Krause said that he would love to have MJ back next season, but that he would have to play for someone else because it isn't going to be Phil Jackson. Just prior to the game starting, a clearly hurt and frustrated Michael Jordan said that this would mean he wouldn't be returning to play basketball because there was no circumstances where he was willing to play without his head coach. Emotions were high heading into tip-off, and although Scottie Pippen was starting in this game, it's worth mentioning that their 6'10 forward Tony Kukoc was out with an injury. This might have been an aspect that MJ mixed up in his memory, and maybe it was actually Kukoc's absence that led MJ to approach Luke Longley about setting the tone early. Not only were the Bulls looking for revenge for their loss to the Jazz earlier that regular season, but they were also looking to channel their anger that had been sparked by Krause's comments. As a result, Chicago stormed out of the gates, playing with a tremendous amount of energy and intensity. In that first quarter, everything seemed to go right for Chicago, as they were hitting 52% of their shots, while the Jazz were only hitting 33%. On top of that, the Bulls forced the Jazz into 5 turnovers, while Chicago didn't commit a single turnover for the entirety of the first. After one, Jordan had 10 points and was 6 of 10 from the field. Luke Longley was doing his job well, just as MJ had asked him to. At the end of the first, Luke had 8 points, 6 rebounds, and 0 blocks, which is far from the 12, 4, and 4 that MJ described. But regardless, that was still a great opening quarter for Longley, and the Bulls had a massive lead of 35-13. But that momentum was hard to hang on to, as Utah was one of the most energetic environments in the NBA at that point. Utah began to storm back, and at the end of the first half, they cut the lead down to 11. Longley had a massive drop-off from his first quarter, as he only had 0 points, 2 rebounds, and 1 block in the second quarter. Now into the third quarter, and the Jazz strongly secured the momentum of the game, as John Stockton was facilitating as if he was in his peak form, and Karl Malone was getting basket after basket, all while Longley was continuously getting beat in the paint. Roughly halfway into the third quarter, and Pippen comes up hobbling after he aggravated his back. He was then taken out of the game and was done for the night. This may have been why MJ thought he didn't play this game, because Pippen's playing time was eventually limited because of the injury. Without Kukoc and Pippen for the rest of the night, MJ had to try to carry the team offensively, so he started looking to score nearly every time down the court. MJ was getting his points, but he was having to take a lot of shots to make it happen, all while Longley is still struggling to get himself going. And that third quarter, Luke had 0 points, 2 rebounds, and 2 turnovers. By the fourth quarter, the writing was on the wall as the outcome started to become very clear for everyone who was watching. MJ was doing his best to keep Chicago in it as he scored 11 points in the fourth quarter alone. But the Jazz shot a lethal 70.6% from the field over the course of the final 12 minutes. By the time the buzzer sounded, the comeback was complete as the Jazz won the game 101-93. And at this point, they had swept the Bulls in that regular season, which led many Utah fans to think that this was their year to win the championship. Michael Jordan had finished with 40 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists on 17 of 37 shooting. John Stockton had 17 points, 18 assists, and 5 steals. And the mailman, Karl Malone, had finished with 30 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists. Then, of course, there was the central focus of this story, which was Luke Longley. After one quarter, Luke had 8 points, 6 rebounds, and 0 blocks. And at the end of the game, he had just 8 points, 11 rebounds, and 1 block, which again was way off from the 12, 4, and 4 that MJ described. Which brings me to my next point. Michael Jordan was hilariously inaccurate with his telling of this story, more so than any other player in this series so far. He said that Scottie Pippen didn't play, which was false. He said that Luke had 12, 4, and 4, which was false. He said that they were winning by 16 at the end of the first, but it was actually 22. And he said that they lost by 15, but it was actually just 8. In this interview, MJ was literally just throwing out random numbers with full confidence, which I just think is actually quite comical. The spirit of what he was saying was true though, which is essentially that Luke played well in the first and the Bulls were up big. Luke then dropped off for the rest of the game and the Bulls lost. Obviously, they got it all figured out by the end of the season though, considering how the Bulls went on to defeat this same Utah Jazz team in the NBA Finals, which earned them their 6th championship ring in just 8 years. Today, I have a story from the Lakers' 3-time champion Byron Scott that he tells about Michael Jordan destroying one of his teammates. Take a listen.
Your best Michael Jordan story.
Michael Jordan story.
In every game that I went in playing against MJ, first of all, I was like, man, I'm happy it's just twice a year. You know, he ain't in the West Coast, I'm happy it's twice a year. And it wasn't I was scared, it was just like, I know this dude's a killer. I said, but I gotta go out here and show up. And it was games where I guard him, he was 6 for 26. And then there was games, the most he scored on me was 39. But it would take him 30 shots to get it, you know what I'm saying? So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna make it hard on you.
That's a hard 39.
I'm gonna make it hard as hell.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, it's not an easy.
You're gonna respect, I respect you, but you're gonna have to work for this. Right. So it's funny because we played against him in the Forum, and it was my 10th year in the league. So it was my last year with the Lakers at that time. We had drafted a guy, Anthony Peeler.
You guys remember Anthony Peeler?
Lefty, exactly. So I hurt my ankle.
Chicago Bulls coming in town, and unfortunately, I got a sprained ankle.
So the trainer's like, I don't know if you're gonna be able to play tonight. And I was like, well, we'll see, let's just wait till game time. So Chicago's bus is coming down the Forum, and I'm walking out, MJ gets off.
MJ says, B. Scott, what's going on? I said, what's up, MJ? He said, man, I hear that you're not playing tonight. I said, no, I sprained my ankle. He said, who's guarding me? I said, Anthony Peeler. He said, oh, 50.
The rookie? Shit, 50. Swear to God. Hey.
So I told Anthony Peeler, listen, MJ, he's probably going to go for about 50 tonight on you, so just...
I go home, I come back to the game, got my suit on. The players go out to warm up, and then Anthony's coming towards the bench, and I say, Anthony, listen. He said he's going for 50 tonight, so what you don't want to do is piss him off.
Right. I enjoy guarding Mike, because he was, the one thing I did with Mike is I never got him pissed off.
Yeah. I said, this is how you guard MJ. I said, don't be all physical and trying to body him, because he's going to go around you, man. Yeah. I said, back up, give him space, dare him to shoot jump shots, challenge him. He make them.
Right.
He make a shot, you say, good shot, Mike. You don't talk trash to him so he can go off for 60. You try to kill him with kindness. Yeah. You don't try to talk trash to him.
I got him. Okay. Every time MJ scored, he looked at me on the bench.
Told you.
54.
No, just be cool. He ended up with 54. So the man could do basically whatever he wanted to do on that basketball court.
Now, Byron Scott tells a great Michael Jordan story, but just how accurate is it? Well, let's look at the clues and figure out which game he's talking about. Well, according to Scott, the game was played in the Great Western Forum in Los Angeles. And since these two teams were in separate conferences, we know the Bulls only played in Los Angeles once that regular season. Then Scott said it was his 10th season in the league, which he said was his last year of his first stint in Los Angeles. He also said that Anthony Peeler was a rookie that season. And all of this information lines up specifically with the 1992 to 1993 season, which tells me that I found the game that he was talking about. It occurred on November 20th, 1992, between the 7-1 Chicago Bulls and the 3-3 Los Angeles Lakers. Now, what you need to understand is that Michael Jordan was at his absolute peak of his abilities and at his peak of his intimidating reputation. At this point, Jordan had just won the last 2 NBA championships. He had just won the last 2 Finals MVPs. He had won the last 2 scoring titles. He had won the last 2 league MVPs. And he was fresh off of leading the men's USA team to an Olympic gold medal. Based on the fact that Jordan had such a strong start to this season, they appeared to be on their way to their 3rd straight championship. To sum it all up, Jordan was winning basically everything in the game of basketball, and everyone was wishing that they were like Mike. So when a fully confident, fully prime, and fully revered Jordan says that he's gonna drop 50 on an NBA rookie, you tend to believe him. Now, Scott was in fact out of the game with a sprained ankle, but to say that a 22-year-old rookie Anthony Peeler had the lone assignment of guarding Michael Jordan was a bit misleading. In reality, it was a rotation of 3 guards who had that responsibility. The first was the 6'3" Tony Smith. The second was the 6'2" Sedale Threatt. And of course, the 6'4" Anthony Peeler. The thing is, Peeler wasn't even one of the starting guards for this game, as Smith and Threatt got those honors. Tony Smith was the one who had the first crack at MJ, and Jordan quickly went to work, burying his first jumper just inside of the 3-point line. Now this story is famous for the angle that MJ dominated the contest with his scoring. But that would be selling it short, as MJ was doing just about everything on the court, from the facilitating to the rebounding, and he was even the top shot blocker for both teams. Despite MJ's all-around onslaught, Los Angeles was still executing pretty well when they had the ball, and due to this, the game was remaining extremely close. The rookie Peeler didn't get his first shot at guarding MJ until the final few minutes of the first, and at that point, Jordan's aggression to score the ball became even more intense. After his second made jump shot over Peeler, legendary commentator Hubie Brown mentioned how Jordan was talking trash to the Lakers bench, which was presumably towards Byron Scott.
Not only that, but he's talking to the guys on the sideline. Okay, so
after the Lakers coaching staff realized that the Peeler situation was actually fueling Jordan's wrath, they then put the 6'9" power forward AC Green on Michael to see if he would fare any better, but MJ was obviously torching him as well. By the end of the first half, Jordan had scored baskets while being defended by Tony Smith, Sedale Threatt, Anthony Peeler, AC Green, and Sam Perkins. Essentially, nearly everyone had their shot at MJ, and they all got burned. Despite all of that, the Bulls only had a 3-point lead at halftime. Throughout the third quarter, MJ just kept abusing the starting defender, Tony Smith. It wasn't until the final 2.5 minutes of the third that Peeler would get another shot. Inevitably, this was yet another mistake by Los Angeles. A determined Jordan scored 8 points in the final 2.5 minutes of the third. And after the last field goal, the commentators yet again mentioned how MJ was chirping at the sidelines.
Trying to get a little motion in their offense. 33 seconds left in the quarter. Michael Jordan just glanced over at our table like, I'm even impressed with the way I'm playing. He has 40.
With only seconds left in the third, MJ had a chance to really get an exclamation point on Peeler, as he got the ball on a breakaway, yet somehow fumbled the rock out of bounds, showing that he is in fact human. At the end of the third, Jordan had 40 points, and the Lakers coaching staff had seen enough, as Jordan was no longer Peeler's defensive assignment. Fast forward deep into the fourth quarter, and the game is extremely close, thanks to massive performances from the Lakers' Sam Perkins and James Worthy. There's now just moments left to go in the fourth quarter, and the Bulls are down by a basket. With the ball in Michael's hands, MJ shoots a long 2, which he misses, but Scottie Pippen clutchly secured the rebound and tied the game with his own jumper, which sent the game to overtime. We now fast forward to the final moments of OT, and Michael finds himself in the same situation. They're down 2 points with just seconds remaining, and they desperately need a basket. This time, MJ delivers as he drove to the baseline and hit an insanely tough fadeaway over the outstretched arm of the 6'11" Eldon Campbell. With just over 5 seconds left in the contest, it was the Lakers' turn, and thanks to a perfectly executed play off of the inbounds pass, Vlade Divac was heading to the line with 2 seconds left. He buried both free throws, putting Los Angeles up by 2. Once again, the fate of the game was in Jordan's hands. He catches the inbounds pass and launches a good look at a game-winning 3. But it was just long, and the Lakers won the game instead, 120-118. At the end of the contest, Jordan had a monstrous stat line of 54 points, 13 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 blocks on nearly 54% shooting. Although the rookie Anthony Peeler gets the short end of the stick on this story, he was actually only guarding MJ during 6 of his 21 field goals made. So maybe that's not really fair to him. Other than that, Scott was pretty spot on with the details of the event. Maybe the initial plan was to have Peeler guard Jordan more, But again, every time MJ started heating up against Peeler and started talking to the Lakers bench, they were quick to put someone else on him instead, which to me is the most fascinating part out of all of this, and really tells you the level of intimidation that Jordan had over the competition at that time. The year is 2003. Kobe Bryant is in the early years of building his legacy, as the Los Angeles Lakers are the defending NBA champions looking for their 4th straight title. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan's legacy has been cemented for years. He turns 40 years old in just 8 days, and his Washington Wizards are battling for a playoff berth, currently sitting in the 8th and final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. All of that is put on hold entering this weekend in February, as Jordan is looking for an enjoyable send-off, participating in his final All-Star game, while for Kobe, it's just another weekend of doing Mamba things. Vince Carter was voted as a starter for the Eastern Conference, and deservedly so with his elite play on the court, but this was all about Jordan's final All-Star game, and so Carter opted to give his starting spot to MJ. Let's take a moment to just marvel at the talent in these starting lineups. In the East, you have 3 of the greatest perimeter scorers of all time, and one of them is the GOAT. Then on the interior, you have one of the greatest defenders ever, and then throw in Jermaine O'Neal, who was a legit star at the time for the Pacers. In the West, you have the scariest front line maybe ever, you have the Mamba, no need to say more, and then you have Stevie Franchise, who was a rising superstar before injuries got in the way. What a time to be a fan of NBA basketball. On a side note, Shaq was basically the greatest sixth man of all time because Chinese voters loved themselves some Yao Ming. Game underway now, and it's actually sloppy to start. The amount of defense being played is surprisingly high by the All-Star Game starters, but the turnovers are also through the roof. Along with the sloppiness of the teams, there was also an incredibly slow start from Jordan, who was looking to assert himself, but missed his first 7 shots of the game. It looked as if we were going to have a weak All-Star game, but things would pick up dramatically. The offense picks up in the second quarter with much more open basketball, but a lot of that had to do with a relaxed defense. Halfway through the second quarter, the defense picks up again, and the cause is clear to commentator Mike Fratello.
And you know why the game has settled back down again? Because Michael Jordan's on the floor is one of the reasons. Kobe Bryant for the other team. Both of those guys bring a sense of order to the game.
Jordan and Kobe played the first quarter, and their intensity kept the team's defenses up. When they sat, the game became more relaxed. When they returned, it was intense again. The 2 greatest players in this contest were also the 2 that would set the tone and leave their imprint on this game as a whole. Into the second half, and Jordan begins to find his groove. Then at the free throw line, he became the all-time leader in all-star scoring. 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter now, and Jordan continues his strong play down the stretch, with this incredibly tough shot in the heart of the defense, which makes it an 8-point game. The West was far from done, and responded with a series of baskets in the paint and stops on the defensive end. The East is up by 1 point with only about 20 seconds remaining when Jordan drives to the basket and gets his shot blocked. Kobe secures the rebound. The Mamba then begins his attack and is fouled from behind by Jordan. Now Kobe is at the free throw line with the game on the line. We all know he's automatic, right? Not this time. And now Jordan's letting him hear about it. Must make free throw for Kobe. And he buries it, tying the game at 120. Out of the timeout, and now it's MJ's turn, with a solid defender and Sean Marion right on him. He goes for the fadeaway, and comes up short. We're going to overtime. If you thought the theme between Jordan and Kobe was going to change in overtime, think again. This is where the heir apparent asserted himself. Kobe was leading the charge for the West, scoring and assisting in all but one of the West's baskets in overtime. Collectively, the East was playing well too, and all this set up yet another opportunity for MJ to make his mark on the game's final moments. Game is tied. Jason Kidd gets the ball to Jordan, who's got Sean Marion draped all over him. He drives to the baseline and hits an incredibly tough fadeaway to put the East on top. The crowd is ecstatic, his teammates are loving it, and all seems right in the basketball universe, as Jordan once again appears to have made an iconic game winner, this time in his final All-Star game, in what is a beautiful send-off to the greatest player of all time. But there's still 3 seconds left on the clock, and on the opposing team, there's one man who's aspired to be better than Jordan throughout his entire playing career. One man who's just too damn competitive to simply lay over and let Jordan have this moment all to himself. One man who will do whatever it takes to win, regardless of who it affects and what it disrupts. Inbounds pass goes to Kobe. He shoots a contested corner 3 and is fouled. The East is dumbfounded by the call, and even by the look on Kobe's face, it appears he might have got away with something. When you look at the replay, you can see that Kobe really put his body out on the line. But is this a foul? I don't know. You tell me. But what I do know is that Kobe did everything he could to sell it. 2-point game and 3 free throws coming for the Mamba. Kobe barely makes the first one. Second free throw is up, and Kobe misses that one. Now the real pressure is on. Immediately after this miss, Jordan is in Kobe's ear now, trying to get into his head to make him miss the next free throw. Must make here, and Jordan continues to talk literally up until the moment Kobe releases the ball. He buries the free throw, tying the game, and then turns around to say something to MJ, and MJ gives him this look. I can't tell you how much money I would give to hear all of the words exchanged in this epic sequence. East calls a timeout with 1 second left. It's a catch and shoot situation. You know who the ball is going to. Jason Kidd inbounds to Jordan, but this time Sean Marion is ready for it and blocks his shot. With the buzzer sounding in a tie, this made this game the only All-Star game in NBA history to go to a double overtime. Heading into this second overtime, Jordan was a near 40-year-old man who had just logged 36 minutes in an exhibition game, and this is taking place in the middle of the season, where the Wizards are sitting in the 8th spot with Jordan fighting to lead his team to the playoffs. Heavy minutes was not something Jordan was planning on doing. The plan may have been to give him a rest and bring him back to close the final few minutes, but that would not end up happening. Because after Garnett scores on the first possession, Fratello once again sounds like a genius, saying this.
If I was Isaiah Thomas right now, I'd really be worried about this team on the floor. I know he's trying to give guys minutes in the game, but the Western team that's on the floor has been out there. They're warmed up. They're active. You're bringing a couple guys in cold. You're very small right now. This could be a quick 8-zip, 9-0 burst for the Western Conference to start this next overtime.
And that is exactly what happened. Kevin Garnett led the charge, getting a series of baskets, and then Kobe iced the game, hitting a 3 and pushing it to a double-digit lead for the West, which the East would never recover from. The final score ended up being a 155-145 victory for the West, and Kevin Garnett would be named the game's MVP. In my opinion, this is the most legendary All-Star game of all time, and not because it was necessarily the best All-Star game from a pure basketball standpoint, but because of the fact that it was a great game to go along with all the icons and all the symbolism. We got to see MJ and Kobe battle it out, while appreciating the similarities between the two greats. It also symbolized a passing of the torch between these two legends. Michael Jordan is famous for excelling in the NBA playoffs, and has had some truly iconic moments on the game's biggest stage. With that being said, Jordan's best playoff series of his entire career is something that is almost never discussed or considered. If you go back and you watch this series as a whole, you'll see that MJ basically played perfect basketball in nearly every aspect of the game, while carrying his squad in instances where they needed him to. It took place in 1990 in the second round of the Eastern Conference playoffs. This was before the Bulls had won their first championship, and it was the first season of Phil Jackson's head coaching career. The Bulls were the 3rd seed and the 76ers were the 2nd seed. Philadelphia's roster was extremely strong at the top, as they had that season's MVP runner-up Charles Barkley, who put up some truly goofy averages along the course of the regular season. Beside him was the All-Star caliber 2-guard Hersey Hawkins, who finished 5th overall for the Most Improved Player award while averaging nearly 19 points per game. One of the biggest difference makers that season, though, was the enforcer that they had acquired in the offseason, the 6'10 NBA champion Rick Mahorn. He was coming off of a stint with a bad boy Detroit Pistons, who were the long-lasting rival of Michael Jordan. Mahorn was famous for being one of the biggest punishers to Jordan whenever he got to the painted area. Now, Jordan had to deal with this tremendous obstacle in Philadelphia. On top of that, Mahorn had made the NBA's second all-defense team that season, so he wasn't just a problem for MJ, but for the entire league. Obviously, the Bulls had their typical rotation, as MJ had just finished 3rd in the MVP voting, and Scottie Pippen had just experienced his first season as an NBA All-Star. Both teams knew they were in for a dogfight, as they had split the regular season series at 2 games apiece. Now, a couple things that the 76ers had was attitude and physicality, and they were confident in both of those traits heading into this series. Prior to the series tipping off, Rick Mahorn and Charles Barkley were very vocal about the fact that they were going to establish a quote no layup rule, and said that they would punish Jordan whenever he got to the painted area. Clearly, Mahorn was instilling some of that Detroit culture into his new team. Containing MJ wouldn't be an easy task, as he was extremely hot coming off of their first round victory over the Milwaukee Bucks. When Game 1 began, Philly had no answers for MJ whatsoever, as he dropped 39 points, 5 rebounds, 6 assists, 5 steals, and 2 blocks on 60% true shooting. He was going to have to continue having performances like that because Charles Barkley was having his own monster series, as he dropped 30 points and 20 rebounds in Game 1. Ultimately, Jordan and the Bulls were too much in the first game, sealing the victory with a final score of 96-85. Philly was convinced that they had to be even more brutal in Game 2. Jordan was once again on fire through 2.5 quarters of Game 2. Towards the end of the third, Mahorn was ready to send a message, and absolutely leveled MJ as he was attacking the basket. This took the intensity of the series to even greater heights, but after the commotion died down, MJ went right back to fearlessly attacking the rim, and was scoring from all areas of the court. Jordan finished Game 2 with 45 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals on 57% true shooting. After the 101-96 victory, the Bulls were now up 2-0 in the series. The thing is, the teams were now headed back to Philadelphia, where the 76ers were much stronger in that energetic atmosphere. The Bulls looked sluggish to start Game 3, while Philly seemed as if they couldn't miss. Things got so ugly that the 76ers had a 25-point lead halfway through the second quarter. For a while, things didn't improve by much, and by the end of the third quarter, the Bulls were down by 20 points, while MJ had scored 25. The thing about Michael is that he treated every game like it was a must-win, so he then absolutely exploded in the fourth quarter as the Bulls stormed back with the momentum. Not only was MJ leading the rally, but he was doing it from distance, and eventually he hit this clutch three-pointer to cut the lead to 3 with just about a minute remaining. Ultimately, Chicago fell just short, as the Sixers won the game with a final score of 118-112. MJ scored 24 of his 49 points in the fourth quarter alone, and he also had 5 rebounds, 5 assists, and 4 steals on 64.5 true shooting. The 76ers were now heading into Game 4 looking to tie up the series on their home court, and seemingly their job was about to get a lot easier. Tragically, Scottie Pippen's father had just passed away prior to the tip-off of the fourth game, and due to this, Scottie was going to miss that contest. Now the Bulls were short-handed, both offensively and defensively, and heading into that evening, basically everyone was expecting the 76ers to take full advantage, but the guy on the other side of the court always believed he can win, and he was ready to play like it. As expected, Philly came out of the gate strong, but Jordan was controlling all aspects of the game for his Bulls, as he was scoring or facilitating on nearly every play. It's now late in the third quarter, and the Bulls are down by double digits. Knowing that Michael Jordan was the only serious threat, Mahorn decided to send a message again, and hammered Michael as he was attacking the basket. MJ was completely unfazed though, and continued his aggressive play, immediately attacking the basket soon after. If anything, the hard foul only made Jordan more motivated. Once again, MJ erupted in the fourth quarter, closing the gap and eventually taking the lead, as he dropped 18 points in the final 12 minutes. The momentum was theirs, and despite the absence of Scottie Pippen, MJ somehow carried the Bulls to victory and a 3-1 lead in the series. On the night, he had 45 points, 11 assists, 6 rebounds, 2 steals, and 2 blocks on 61% true shooting, in what was one of the most heroic playoff performances of all time. With Pippen now returning to the roster, and with the series now traveling back to Chicago, it seemed as if the series was already over. In Game 5, the Bulls completely dominated in front of their home crowd, closing out the series with a final score of 117-99. And it's worth mentioning that Scottie Pippen had an incredible performance in his first game after his father's passing, as he dropped 29, 6, and 3 on 13 of 17 shooting. MJ was simply MJ, as he dropped 37 points, 9 rebounds, 8 assists, and 6 steals on 65% shooting from the field. Over the 5-game series as a whole, Michael averaged 43 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, 4 steals, and 1.2 blocks on absurd efficiency splits. Again, I believe this is the most flawless basketball that MJ has ever played in an entire playoff series. Yet for some reason, very few people ever talk about it. Michael Jordan's competitive drive and his connection to the Washington organization led him to suit up and play for the Washington Wizards for his final 2 seasons. If you followed this channel for very long, then you've heard me go on and on about how underappreciated Jordan's years were with the Washington Wizards, as he turned the Wizards into legit competitors in the Eastern Conference leading up to his meniscus tear, and Jordan was among the hottest players in the league at that point as well. If it wasn't for a freak accident where Jordan and Eton Thomas collided, then MJ could have taken his Wizards into the East playoffs where they may have made some noise. The thing is, Jordan stepped down from his general manager position with the Wizards in order to play with the team for 2 seasons. Jordan had assumed that when he had finished his tenure as a Wizards player, he would resume his position as the Wizards general manager. The Wizards owner, Abe Pollin, had something else in mind and fired Jordan from the team soon after he finished playing. This hurt Jordan on a personal level, and he said that he felt betrayed by the owner. Jordan later stated that he wouldn't have ever played for the Wizards if he had knew the true status of his relationship with the Wizards owner. So let's hypothetically say that Jordan had knew this. His itch to return to play basketball was almost certainly going to be acted upon regardless. So if he isn't playing for the Wizards, who would he have played for? He's definitely not going back to the Chicago Bulls, as they were not only terrible at that point, but they were also still being managed by Jerry Krause, who famously wasn't near the top of Jordan's buddy list. There's 2 destinations that I think Jordan could have gone to instead. One is the Los Angeles Lakers, where he would have played under Phil Jackson once again, and where he would have taken a mentorship role for Kobe Bryant. The other option is for the Portland Trail Blazers, where he would have played alongside of his former longtime teammate Scottie Pippen. Both of these Western Conference teams were among the NBA's championship contenders. So what do you guys think I'm gonna say? Of course, I wish he would have played for the Los Angeles Lakers, as he would have taken the starting small forward position ahead of the Lakers' Rick Fox. I wish this would have happened instead of his time with the Wizards, as it would have made the most star-studded trio of NBA history, while giving Jordan another opportunity to compete for a couple more championships in the final seasons of his career. Not to mention how interesting it would have been to see Jordan and Kobe have to get along on the same roster. As everyone knows, Jordan was a shooting guard who typically liked to play from the post and didn't really play the point position of the team's offense, except for when Doug Collins was Jordan's coach in the 1989 season. He actually appointed Jordan to the point guard position with only 24 games left in the season. As a point guard, Jordan had 15 assists in his first game. The very next game, Jordan had 21 points, 14 rebounds, and 14 assists against the Pacers in a 32-point blowout win, in which Jordan only played 32 minutes. MJ continued to play at the point guard spot until the end of the year, and in those 24 games, Jordan averaged 30.4 points, 9.2 rebounds, 10.7 assists, and 2.4 steals. In one stretch, he had a triple-double in 7 straight games and in 10 out of 11 games. In the game that Jordan didn't get a triple-double, he finished with 40 points, 11 assists, and 7 rebounds. Not only was Jordan incredible offensively at the point guard position, but as usual, he dominated defensively, as he was first team all-defense and finished 5th overall in the Defensive Player of the Year voting, which was ahead of every other guard that season. After Phil Jackson took over the following season, Jordan returned to the shooting guard position and returned to his role of playing from the post, while Scottie Pippen handled more of the team's distributing. All this goes to say that one can only imagine what Jordan's career would have looked like if he had remained at the point guard position.
It's a narrative we've heard over and over again, often from people who want to diminish Jordan's legacy. The claim is that Michael Jordan dominated a weak era. He didn't start winning until Magic got HIV, until Bird retired because of back problems, and until the Pistons run was done. People assume that because Jordan couldn't win in the 80s, but then won in the 90s, that it's because the competition weakened. But that's an opinion that's severely lacking context. When Jordan was losing in the 80s, Michael was performing at an MVP level, but Scottie Pippen hadn't developed into a co-star until about 1990. Up until that point, Jordan was a lone all-star with a collection of role players going up against the super teams of the 80s. As good as Jordan was, alone he wasn't enough to take down a collection of all-stars like Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish, or a Pistons team with Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, and Dennis Rodman. It takes a team to win in the NBA, and once Scottie Pippen developed into a co-star, the Bulls never looked back. There's also the narrative that when the Bulls finally broke through and beat the Pistons in 1991, it was because the Pistons had become old and the Bulls were younger. This is a bogus narrative that does nothing but discredit the Bulls' greatness. The Pistons' best player, Isaiah Thomas, was only 29 years old. Joe Dumars was 27 years old, Mark Aguirre was 31, Bill Laimbeer was 33, and Dennis Rodman was 29. Most of their best players were in the prime age of their careers, yet the Bulls were too much for them. At that point, we had seen the Bulls and Pistons face each other in the playoffs 4 years in a row. So although the matchup between the Bulls and Pistons was getting old, the Pistons certainly were not. The Bulls didn't start winning because the talent around the league had weakened. They won because a prime Jordan got some much-needed help that the other stars like Thomas and Bird had been enjoying throughout the 1980s. This weak era narrative doesn't just stem from Jordan's failures in the 80s, but it also comes from people discrediting the teams he faced in the finals throughout the 90s. So with that being said, let's break it down year by year, looking at each team Jordan faced in the NBA Finals. The 1991 LA Lakers. The 91 Lakers finished the year with the third best record in the Western Conference with a 58-24 record. They were led by a still elite Magic Johnson, who even at 32 years old, still put up his usual 20 points and 12 assists per game. James Worthy was his usual running mate, who was averaging 21 points per game over the course of the year. There was also quality supporting players like Byron Scott, Vlade Divac, and Sam Perkins. With all of that being said, this was not the same Lakers team of the 1980s. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had recently retired, and both James Worthy and Byron Scott suffered injuries in Game 4 of the series versus the Bulls. Magic Johnson simply didn't have enough support to make the series interesting for Jordan and the Bulls, and the Bulls won the championship comfortably in only 5 games. In my opinion, this was the easiest opposition Jordan ever faced in the NBA Finals. The 1992 Portland Trail Blazers. The 92 Blazers finished the regular season with a 57-25 record, which was the best record in the Western Conference. They were coached by Rick Adelman, who was a respected coach around the league and an annual Coach of the Year candidate. Adelman won nearly 60% of his games over his career and regularly coached teams into being elite squads defensively. This Portland team was no exception, as they were ranked the third best team in the league defensively that year. They were obviously led by Clyde Drexler, who was in the prime of his career, averaging 25 points, 7 boards, and 7 assists. Clyde was the second best shooting guard in the league behind Jordan. Behind their superstar in Clyde, they had plenty of depth to back him up. Clyde's co-star was the point guard Terry Porter, who averaged nearly 20 points per game and orchestrated the team's elite offense. Terry was also one of the most lethal and efficient three-point shooters in the game, which helped spread the floor for the Blazers. At small forward, they had the 29-year-old Jerome Kersey, who just 2 years prior was averaging 20 points per game of his own. They also had Buck Williams at power forward, who was a walking double-double. He was the Rookie of the Year his first year in the league, and Buck was also one of the best defenders in the league at his position. Buck made 4 all-defense teams and was a 3-time NBA All-Star. On top of all of that, they had other quality and veteran players with experience, like the scrappy Danny Ainge, Clifford Robertson, and Kevin Duckworth, and each of those guys had made All-Star appearances in their careers. The deep Blazers had a total of 6 players who averaged double-digit scoring that year, compared to the Bulls, who only had 3 players, Jordan, Pippen, and Horace Grant. So I think you get the point. This Blazers squad was absolutely loaded with talent, and although many of the names on that team have since been forgotten, it would have been absolutely ludicrous in 1992 if you had said their team was weak. The 1993 Phoenix Suns. The 93 Suns had finished the NBA season with a 62-20 record, which was the best record in the entire NBA. Not only did they have the best record in the league and the league's top-rated offense, but they also had the league MVP. Charles Barkley was one of the greatest players in NBA history, who was just 29 years old and coming off of a season where he averaged 25 points, 12 rebounds, and 5 assists. Helping Barkley was an elite 26-year-old point guard, Kevin Johnson, who was a 3-time All-Star and had been on 5 All-NBA teams. Kevin Johnson, the energy and effort behind the Suns season, and had averaged 18 points and 9 assists that year. On this year's Suns was also the recently acquired Danny Ainge, who crossed paths with Jordan a lot in the playoffs. They also had Dan Marley, who was one of the best wing defenders in the NBA at this time, and was also an elite 3-point shooter who was chipping in 17 points per game that season. Add in quality veteran scorers like Tom Chambers and Cedric Ceballos, and what you have is one of the greatest teams ever to fail to win a championship. I'm telling you guys, this Phoenix team was incredible. They had absolutely everything, but it just wasn't meant to be. The Bulls were clicking at the right time, and Jordan had arguably the greatest final series of any player ever, as he averaged an incredible 41 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 6.3 assists over a hard-fought 6-game series. The 1996 Seattle Supersonics. This Sonics team was another nasty one. The 96 Sonics finished their season with a 64-18 record, which was the best record in the Western Conference, but was still overshadowed by the Bulls' 72-10 record. They were coached by a Coach of the Year winner, George Karl, and with the exception of Jordan's Bulls, the Sonics had the best defense in the league that season. This Sonics group didn't have a single player who averaged over 20 points per game that season, but they were extremely gritty and well-balanced. They had their prime superstar tandem of Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp. Kemp averaged nearly 20 points and 11 boards and was known for his ferocity and aggression around the rim. Payton was also averaging almost 20 points, was an excellent facilitator, and was that season's steals champion and Defensive Player of the Year. Then you had Hersey Hawkins, who was a quality scorer and spark for the Sonics, Detlef Schrempf, a 6'9 small forward who was a 2-time Sixth Man of the Year winner who was averaging 17 points per game that season. These are the type of guys that people don't remember, but who are the difference makers in playoff basketball. This Sonics team was definitely championship worthy. With their collection of talent and their gritty defensive identity, they really remind me of the 2003-2004 Detroit Pistons, who used their team effort to take down the super team Lakers. As worthy as the Sonics team was, no one was beating Jordan and the 72-10 Bulls that season. The 1997 Utah Jazz. The 97 Jazz finished the regular season with a 64-18 record, which was the best record in all of the Western Conference. The Jazz were the second best offense in the league that season, behind Jordan's Bulls, and they were also a top 10 defensive team. If you exclude Magic Johnson and Tim Duncan, then the 97 Jazz had arguably the greatest power forward ever and the greatest point guard ever in their starting 5. Stockton and Malone were a dynamic, championship-worthy tandem on both the offensive end and the defensive end. Even beyond Stockton and Malone, the Jazz had plenty of depth that's been forgotten over the years, like Jeff Hornacek, who was a consistent and reliable third option for the Jazz, who was one of the best three-point shooters in the league. You know this Jazz team was legit by simply considering who they had to beat just to get to the finals. In the Western Conference Finals, the Jazz defeated the Houston Rockets in 6 games. A Rockets super team stacked with Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and Clyde Drexler leading the way. This Jazz team earned their stripes, but the Bulls handled them comfortably in 6 games. The 1998 Utah Jazz. The 98 Jazz had relatively the same strong roster and finished the regular season with the best offense in the league and a 62-20 record. The most significant thing that changed since the previous season was that the Bulls had weakened. Jordan was 35 years old, Rodman was 37 years old, and Pippen was 32 and had missed nearly half of the season due to his laboring back problems. Yet despite all of those disadvantages, Jordan still led the Bulls to win in 6 games over the Jazz for their second straight season. In that finals series, Jordan quite literally carried the Bulls as he averaged 33.5 points of the Bulls' 88 points per game that series. Now that I've recapped each finals team Jordan faced in the 90s, I want to make my closing point about generational talent. It's easy for the casual NBA fan to look at Jordan's competition of the 90s and criticize it because people simply don't remember the talent or weren't even watching at the time, so they don't truly know how talented those teams were. People won't remember the overall talent of teams, and it becomes just about the stars. The young casuals will say things like, "So Jordan and Pippen beat Barkley in the finals, big deal. What else did Barkley have?" A lot. Actually. Heck, sometimes it's not even the solid role players who get forgotten, but sometimes it's even the star players themselves. A perfect example of a modern player who could eventually be forgotten is Paul George. Sure, he puts up great numbers, but in 2 to 3 decades, people won't be talking about this guy. How do I know this? Because I've already seen it with guys like Adrian Dantley, Sidney Moncrief, Clyde Drexler, and Alex English. These were guys who averaged 25 to 30 points per game and carried their franchises year in and year out. But into the future, people generally don't talk about the greats who didn't win championships. So again, with that in mind, it's easy to see why people diminish Jordan's competition in the 90s, because when Jordan was playing in the 90s, he was the only one winning. And those are the ones we remember. No matter how you try and spin it, the reality is that Michael Jordan led a Bulls team that dominated an era of legitimate and fierce competition that many people just simply don't remember or just never knew. What if the Rockets made the trade? The 1984 NBA draft class is famously known as one of the greatest draft classes of all time. Most of us hardcore basketball fans know the draft order off the top of our heads. Hakeem Olajuwon to the Rockets, then Sam Bowie to the Blazers, and then Michael Jordan to the Chicago Bulls. What many people don't realize was that there was nearly a blockbuster trade that night that would have drastically changed the course of basketball history. You see, the Houston Rockets had the first overall pick, and at the time, Hakeem Olajuwon appeared to be the clear choice to be taken first. The thing is, the Rockets already had a star playing at center, which was the future Hall of Famer, Ralph Sampson, who had just come off his rookie season where he averaged 21 points and 11 rebounds. Other teams around the league also knew that the Rockets were in a bit of a dilemma, so the Portland Trail Blazers made an offer of their second overall pick and their young star in Clyde Drexler in return for Ralph Sampson. Drexler had shown promise at this young stage of his career, but he was still pretty unproven, so the trade Portland offered looked pretty appealing at the time, but in hindsight, we can now see how horrible it would have been for their team. If the Rockets had accepted the offer, they would have had Clyde Drexler and the first and second overall pick, which they almost certainly would have used to take Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan, forming what would have been on paper the strongest big three in NBA history. Obviously, there's the questions of fit and on-court chemistry, but at a certain point, a team has so much talent that even if they underperform by their standards, they're still likely dominating the league. Olajuwon and Jordan were both elite players the second they set foot on the court, and they were both elite until about 1998. With the greatest player of all time, one of the greatest centers of all time, and arguably a top 5 shooting guard of all time, what is the realistic projection for the success of this team? At least 10 championships? It sounds bold, but at the same time, completely reasonable. This would have dramatically changed the Lakers and Celtics rivalry of the 80s, because now, the Rockets are likely keeping the Lakers from making the NBA Finals in the mid to late 80s. I could go on and on about the ways this would have reshaped the league for years to come, but ultimately, the trade never went down, because although they wrestled with the offer, the Rockets instead played it safe, kept Sampson, and went with the Twin Tower approach by selecting Olajuwon. Although Hakeem would eventually lead Houston to win 2 championships, given what they could have had if they had accepted the offer, this non-trade was likely the greatest regret of the franchise's history. Now before I get into this, let me first make a point. If someone was to say to you, man, wasn't Kevin Durant a disappointment in the 2019 NBA Finals? It's a shame that he couldn't get the team over the hump. You would probably be confused and remind that person that Kevin Durant got hurt and didn't finish the series because of it. As obvious as this logic sounds, people do this all the time with Michael Jordan's years in Washington. Michael Jordan's 2002 season was cut short because of a meniscus tear. He couldn't even finish the season, yet people blame him for missing the playoffs. I don't know if it's that people don't remember, they weren't paying attention, or if they simply just choose to ignore this fact. But it's really a bad look and appears ignorant when people use it as a criticism against him. Now here's the thing, Jordan and the Wizards were a lot better than people remember before he tore his meniscus. He had pretty solid numbers on the season and had led Washington to many crucial victories over Eastern Conference contenders, but he was getting even better as the season went on. In his last 10 games leading up to his injury, Jordan was averaging nearly 30 points, over 6 rebounds, and over 6 assists on 47% shooting. Individually, he was completely on fire leading up to the injury, but Washington was dominating as a team as well. They had a 26-21 record at the time of Jordan's injury, which put them easily in the playoff picture. But that record alone is severely lacking context. The Wizards' second best player was Richard Hamilton, who missed 5 weeks of their 26-21 stretch due to Hamilton's groin injury. After Hamilton healed and returned to the floor, the Wizards went on a dominant 15-1 streak while they had both Jordan and Hamilton on the floor. They were also easily the best team in the league defensively during that stretch, allowing only 86.3 points per game. So in a nutshell, Jordan was nearly 40 years old and was performing at an MVP level, and the Wizards were not only in the playoff hunt, but they were starting to look like one of the best teams in the entire Eastern Conference. And the only thing that ruined that momentum was Jordan's teammate Eton Thomas falling on his knee and tearing his meniscus. I wish this injury did not happen. It would have been amazing to see what noise Jordan and the Wizards could have made in the Eastern Conference playoffs. I really doubt they beat Jason Kidd's New Jersey Nets to get to the NBA Finals, where they would have faced Shaq and Kobe's Lakers, but it is possible that they might have. Neither you or I know for sure, but I really wish I could have seen that season play out for MJ.
Michael Jordan is too much of a ball hog to win championships. Can you imagine a time where Michael Jordan's biggest criticism was that he didn't win enough? Well, in the mid to late 80s, that was the reality we lived in. Jordan was putting up MVP numbers the instant he entered the NBA, but even with a points per game average in the mid-30s, Jordan was often criticized for not making his teammates better and for being too much of a ball hog. It makes sense when you consider the fact that Jordan's superstar peers, like Magic, Bird, and Isaiah Thomas, were all players who liked to pass as much as they liked to shoot, and those guys were the ones winning all the championships while Jordan was getting bounced in the first round. People actually believed that Jordan's offensive aggressiveness was why he wasn't winning, but up to that point, that was a powerful narrative throughout the NBA's history. Wilt Chamberlain won scoring titles, while a team player like Bill Russell won NBA titles. Magic and Bird led dynasties, while scorers like Jordan get bounced in the first round. It wasn't until Phil Jackson arrived and Pippen developed into an all-star that the Bulls started winning and the narrative was destroyed. Turns out you can have a dynasty that's led by a shoot-first type player. In the 1980s, the NBA was very, very different. The game was much more physical, and a lot of the plays that are now called technical and flagrant fouls were just routine plays back then. The culture amongst the players was also incredibly different. Trash talking was at its peak, and players from different teams legitimately hated each other. Players were not going on cruise ships together or would ever be caught dead on a banana boat together. The off-season focus was on destroying one another and definitely not scheming to join forces. The competition was incredibly fierce, and there was no shortage of both personal and team rivalries. One of the most iconic teams of the 80s were the Detroit Pistons. The 1980s were physical days of basketball, but the Pistons took that to another level entirely. The squad was full of strong characters, guys like Dennis Rodman, the tenacious and scrappy defender, a wild card who played with hustle and heart unmet by his peers, Rick Mahorn, the enforcer, who you definitely did not want to aggravate, Bill Laimbeer, the savage big man who seemed to enjoy being hated more than anything else and was always seemingly involved in the middle of every fight. They were led by none other than Isaiah Thomas, the General, a quick 6'1" point guard with a bigger-than-life smile off the court, but a cold-blooded killer on it. He was a driven leader with the clutch gene and had the courage to stand up to anyone. Together, they were a group notorious for their swagger, attitude, and extremely aggressive defense, which is putting it lightly. The squad's motto became domination by intimidation, and they certainly lived up to it.
It was as if any given night you could turn on the television and see the Pistons players in a full-fledged brawl and no one would be surprised. Their reputation transcended sports, as the team was coined the Raiders of the NBA due to their bad boy image and their aggressive attitudes. The players and fans embraced the comparison, as did the Oakland Raiders organization, going as far as sending official Raiders memorabilia to the Pistons players and coaches. The numbers spoke for themselves though. The 80s Pistons were one of the elite defensive units in the league year in and year out. Meanwhile, the young and upcoming Chicago Bulls were led by Michael Air Jordan. You know this guy. Even in his younger years before all the championships, he wasn't just an NBA superstar, he was a rock star, an American icon. He already earned the respect of other stars around the league, but as far as the Pistons, they seemed to be particularly repulsed by Jordan's flair. In the 1987 season, Jordan showed the Pistons what he was capable of, dropping 61 points in an absolutely dominant effort, leading the Bulls to a 125-120 overtime victory. Just 1 year later, on an Easter Sunday in front of a nationally televised audience, Jordan embarrassed the Pistons again, this time dropping 59 points in a 112-110 victory. This infuriated Pistons head coach Chuck Daly, who then promised after the game to never allow Jordan to torch them again. Later that season, Chuck would have the opportunity to uphold his promise. The two teams met in the 1988 Eastern Conference semifinals. The Pistons had just finished with the second best record in the Eastern Conference. Jordan was coming off of an MVP and Defensive Player of the Year season. Despite Michael's best efforts, Chicago was no match for Detroit in a 7-game series, with Detroit winning the series comfortably 4-1. The following year, when the 1989 playoffs began, Jordan had his sights set on revenge. This time, the two teams met in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Bulls were able to win one of the first 2 games in Detroit, and then when the series returned to Chicago, it appeared as if nothing was going to stop Michael Jordan. Then, with the ball in his hands for the final moments, Jordan did what Jordan does. With Chicago now leading the series 2-1, Isaiah Thomas was left restless that evening, trying to figure out how to stop Jordan. Isaiah called his teammate and co-captain, Joe Dumars, and that evening they were up until the middle of the night, contemplating, planning, and scheming. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Isaiah calls the coaching staff with one clear message: I figured out what we need to do to stop Michael Jordan. And in that moment, the Jordan rules were born. The Pistons then approached the next game with a whole new level of ferocity and intensity, and the results were evident. Information began to leak to the press of the Jordan rules, but then when asked about the rules, the Pistons sarcastically pretended as if they didn't exist. The Jordan rules had multiple components, but few were essential. Rule number 1. Force Michael into traffic. If Jordan was on the strong side of the court, force him towards the middle and collapse the defense upon him. If Jordan was on the middle of the floor, force him to the left where the help defender is waiting to meet him. Rule number 2. Make someone else beat you. Bill Laimbeer was quoted to say, "We don't worry about Pippen. As far as we're concerned, they're Jordan and the Jordanaires." The Pistons were constantly throwing multiple defenders at MJ and showed little respect for the other Bulls players on the floor, but they believed if Jordan wasn't going to beat them, then the Bulls definitely wouldn't. Rule number 3. Make Jordan work harder. The Pistons began to attack the Bulls offensively with whichever player Michael was guarding. The concept was that with Jordan using so much energy on the defensive end, there was little energy left over for him on the offensive end. And rule number 4, punish Jordan. The Pistons would no longer allow any easy baskets to Michael. When Jordan got to the paint, they put him on his butt. That was the rule, and they did it over and over again. The formula worked, and the Bulls would not win another game in the series. Fast forward to the month of June, and the Detroit Pistons were NBA champions, sweeping the Los Angeles Lakers 4-0. The 1989 Pistons were being considered one of the greatest defenses in NBA history, but as usual, they weren't without their fair share of criticism. Even though the team was made up of undeniable winners, the stigma of a dirty team was still very present. The Bulls-Pistons rivalry was just getting warmed up. In the 1990 NBA playoffs, the Bulls and Pistons met again in the Eastern Conference Finals. It was an epic series with the Jordan rules in full force. Jordan was again being targeted and taking an overwhelming amount of physical abuse, but he was also getting his own. The progression and maturation of the Bulls team was clearly seen as they forced a Game 7 in Detroit, but Chicago still wasn't ready to dethrone the Pistons and lost in the deciding game, eliminated from the playoffs for the third straight year at the hand of the Pistons. The Pistons went on to win their second straight NBA championship. Michael Jordan was now hell-bent on revenge and spent the offseason in the gym growing stronger and preparing himself for the physical task of facing the Detroit Pistons once again. Jordan's supporting cast also had another offseason of maturation and growing as a better ball club. Another meeting in this rivalry was inevitable, and the two teams were set to square off again in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Bulls and their leader were stronger, faster, and just an overall better team than the Pistons. The age and wear and tear was beginning to show for the Detroit players, while Chicago players were all seemingly reaching their athletic peaks. It wasn't much of a series, but more of a statement. The Bulls dominated the Detroit Pistons and were on the verge of winning their fourth game of the series to complete the sweep over Detroit. The score was a blowout in favor of Chicago, and in the final minutes of the last game of the series, Isaiah Thomas made one of the biggest decisions of his basketball career. The Detroit players had a brief discussion while on the bench of those last moments, and agreed that together they would head straight to the locker room before the final buzzer had even sounded. Their reign was coming to an end on their terms. With 7.9 seconds left, the Detroit Pistons left their bench, walking to the locker room while awkwardly passing by the Bulls bench, refusing to shake the victors' hands or even make eye contact with them. This was a huge slap in the face to Chicago for refusing to shake hands, which is customary for teams at the end of a playoff series. It was also a black eye for the image of the league. The respect level around the league for the Detroit Pistons had hit an all-time low. Meanwhile, the Bulls were moving on to face Magic Johnson and the Los Angeles Lakers in the NBA Finals. The Bulls went on to win the series in commanding fashion 4-1. Michael Jordan was now an NBA champion and on top of the basketball world. Summer of 1991, just days after the NBA Finals had come to a close, the official selection committee for the USA's Olympic basketball team were making their selections as to which NBA players would be representing their country for the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona. This was a huge deal. It was the first time in history that NBA players would be representing the USA in the Summer Olympics. The timing could not have possibly been any worse for Isaiah Thomas. The committee selected Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Scottie Pippen, Clyde Drexler, Charles Barkley, David Robinson, Chris Mullin, Patrick Ewing, Karl Malone, John Stockton, and the college phenom Christian Laettner. This team went on to be famously known as the Dream Team, arguably the greatest basketball team ever assembled. Missing from the roster was future Hall of Fame point guard and captain of the recent two-time champion Pistons, Isaiah Thomas. If talent alone was the determining factor in the selection process, then leaving Isaiah off the team seemed like an obviously gigantic mistake. Oddly enough, the committee had selected Detroit Pistons head coach Chuck Daly to lead the Dream Team in the Olympics. Rumors began to swirl that Michael Jordan was in fact responsible for Isaiah being left off the team. Obviously, Michael did not like Isaiah. The Jordan rules and the end of the 1991 series was something Michael had fresh in his memory. It was believed that Michael gave the committee an ultimatum, that he would not be joining the Dream Team if Isaiah Thomas was on it. On numerous occasions, Michael has denied such allegations, but in a book released in 2012 by author and basketball writer Jack McCallum, he quotes Jordan to say, "Rod, I don't want to play if Isaiah Thomas is on the team," to USA Selection Committee member Rod Thorne. Jordan has continued to deny those claims. Several players of the USA Dream Team have since said that they also did not want Isaiah on the team. Magic Johnson, a longtime friend of Isaiah, even said in his book, nobody on that team wanted to play with him. So maybe the collective voice of the players led the committee to leave Isaiah off the team. Or maybe the committee themselves simply didn't want him on the team. But it is plausible that Michael Jordan's supposed ultimatum was the swaying factor in the selection process. We may never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that the 1992 Dream Team is one of the greatest teams of all time. The Jordan era continued for many years after, and that era's Detroit Pistons were never again serious title contenders, with Isaiah Thomas's career coming to a somewhat bitter end in what was otherwise known as a legendary career.
So it's been a highly requested video and one that I'm excited to deliver today. What were the 10 greatest MVP seasons of NBA history? Obviously, everyone's list is going to be different, so let me know your agreements and disagreements in the comments section. First off, let's establish how my list works. The MVP is a regular season award, so that's the only part of the season I'll be factoring into my list. Regardless of how well a player did in the postseason, it won't factor into his ranking on the top 10 list. Just like traditional MVP voting, I will also factor in team success into the rankings, especially in terms of how much that MVP influenced his team's success. So now, before we get into the meat of the list, these are my honorable mentions. Wilt Chamberlain in 1960, who put up monstrous numbers in his rookie season. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, formerly known as Lou Alcindor, in 1971. Michael Jordan in 1991. Kevin Garnett in 2004, LeBron James in 2009, Russell Westbrook in 2017, and Giannis in 2020. I'm sure some of you are already upset, but the show must go on. Number 10, Larry Bird in 1985. This was right in the heart of Larry Bird's prime, as the 28-year-old did everything you would expect from Bird at his best, as he was arguably the best three-point shooter in the league at this point. His court vision and playmaking ability was among the best of the best, and he was a more than capable defender while averaging nearly 30 points a game. With his all-around lethal efficiency, Bird led his Celtics to a league-best 63-19 record, with numbers of 28.7 points, 10.5 rebounds, 6.6 assists, 1.6 steals, and 1.2 blocks on 52.2% shooting. He led the league in minutes, he was the second most efficient three-point shooter in the league, and the only guy ahead of him was Byron Scott, who shot less than half the amount of three-pointers that Bird did, and he was also 8th in the league in rebounds per game and 1st overall at his position. Larry came in strong, but these seasons are the best of the best, so he'll have to settle for just the 10th spot on this list. Number 9, Oscar Robertson in 1964. Other than Russell Westbrook in 2017, this season from Oscar was the closest anyone has ever come to a triple-double MVP season, as he averaged 31.4 points, 9.9 rebounds, and 11 assists on 48.3% shooting. Even in this prime season, he wasn't the most flashy type of player, but he was incredibly smart, fundamentally sound, and dangerous from the mid-range. He was second in the league in scoring, behind only Wilt Chamberlain. He led all players in assists that season, and he also led the league in free throw percentage. He took his Royals to a 55-25 record, which was the second best record in the entire league. It's debatable whether or not this was actually his best season from an individual standpoint, but it was his lone MVP, and it was strong enough to get him into the 9th spot. Number 8, LeBron James in 2013. This wasn't quite LeBron's most monstrous season from a scoring standpoint, but it was definitely the most efficient version of the King that we've ever seen. He put up 26.8 points, 7.3 assists, 8 rebounds, and 1.7 steals on 56.5% shooting. That's basically really great efficiency for a center, but for a wing player, it's absolutely astounding. This was also easily LeBron's greatest season from the three-point line, as he wasn't just solid, but he was actually elite, as he shot 40.6% from that distance. On top of this, LeBron was an absolute force defensively, as the combination of his peak strength and athleticism allowed him to be a stout defender whether he was on a wing or even a big in the post. He finished second overall in the Defensive Player of the Year race, and even that is somewhat questionable considering the fact that the man who beat him only finished on the NBA's second all-defense team. From a team impact standpoint, you can't question how pivotal LeBron's greatness was to his Miami Heat's 66-16 record, which included their 27-game winning streak, which is the second longest streak of NBA history. Number 7, Shaquille O'Neal in 2000. He's certainly the most dominant big man of modern history, and this season was where he was at his best. At this point, Shaq still had most of his athleticism from his Orlando days, but he also put on a tremendous amount of weight and muscle mass. There was little opposing defenders could do to stop him, Sometimes they would hack him on purpose to make him shoot free throws, but the diesel was so strong that it often ended up being an and-one opportunity anyway. As he led his Lakers to a league-best 67-15 record, he put up 29.7 points, 13.6 rebounds, 3.8 assists, and 3 blocks on 57.4% shooting. Not only was he dominant offensively, but he was dominant defensively as well, as his elite rim protection earned him the runner-up spot to the Defensive Player of the Year award. Number 6. Wilt Chamberlain in 1966. Interestingly enough, Wilt Chamberlain's best statistical seasons were actually years that he didn't win the MVP, but even just his pretty good seasons are enough to rank him high on this list. Like this season, for example, as Chamberlain led his 76ers to a 55-25 record with powerful numbers of 33.5 points, 24.6 rebounds, and 5.2 assists on 54% shooting. Steals and blocks were not tracked at that time, but knowing Wilt, if they had been, I'm sure they would have been monstrous as well. Also consider how Philadelphia was one of the best teams defensively that season, and their terrifying anchor in the paint had a ton to do with that. He led all players that season in scoring, rebounding, field goal percentage, and minutes, while also being 7th overall in assists per game. There was very little that Wilt didn't do on the court that season. Number 5. Michael Jordan in 1996. I really don't need to elaborate much on this season from MJ, but I will anyway. His airness led the Bulls to achieve what was at the time the greatest regular season of NBA history with a 72-10 record. In my opinion, this was Jordan's peak in terms of his mastery from the mid-range, as his footwork was clean and precise, and his fadeaway appeared as if it was automatic. Jordan was also just barely outside of the top 10 in three-point efficiency, as he shot a lethal 42.7% from that distance. Throughout the season, he averaged 30.4 points, 4.3 assists, 6.6 rebounds, and 2.2 steals on 49.5% shooting. His 30.4 points led the league in scoring, and what makes it even more impressive is how he scored that many points per game when teams were averaging under 100 points a game. He was also tenacious on the perimeter as usual, as Jordan made first-team all-defense along with his teammates Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman. It's far from his greatest season statistically, but from an overall impact standpoint, and considering how the 96 Bulls are arguably the greatest team ever, 96 Jordan certainly earned his strong position on the list. Number 4. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in 1972. He was without question the most dominant center in the game at this point, as he was in his prime, equipped with the most unstoppable shot of basketball history, the skyhook. With Oscar Robertson by his side, the Bucks stormed through the regular season with a 63-19 record. Kareem did his part with 34.8 points, 16.6 rebounds, and 4.6 assists on a tremendous 57.4% shooting. It's also worth mentioning that it was his dominant performance that put an end to the Lakers' 33-game winning streak, as he dropped 39 points, 20 rebounds, and 5 assists in the historic victory. Because blocks and steals were not tracked at this point, we don't know for sure what kind of defensive numbers he got this year, but based on his 7 prime seasons after they started tracking blocks and steals, he probably averaged anywhere from 1 to 1.5 steals and 3 to 4 blocks. He led all players in scoring, and this was also the greatest season of NBA history in terms of win shares, as he accumulated 25.4 throughout the regular season. Number 3. Wilt Chamberlain in 1967. At this time in his career, Wilt was just entering his 30s, and he had a massive chip on his shoulder due to the narrative that he didn't make his teammates better. His critics said that Wilt was too selfish to win championships like Bill Russell. Because of this, Wilt began to distribute the basketball more, and despite the fact that he was playing at center, he finished 3rd overall in assists per game with 7.8. A more unselfish Chamberlain meant that he could be more selective with his shots, and it resulted in all-time lethal efficiency. On his 14.2 shots per game, he made a ridiculous 68.3%. Of the players who've attempted at least 10 shots per game, that is easily the highest field goal percentage of NBA history. He played all 81 games that year as he put up 24.1 points, 24.2 rebounds, and 7.8 assists on 68.3% shooting. Not only was he 3rd in assists, but he was also the league's rebounding leader, its field goal percentage leader, and its minutes leader, while leading his 76ers to a 68-13 record, which at the time was the greatest team record of NBA history. Unfortunately, the season wasn't without at least one weakness, as it was also one of his worst seasons from the free throw line, as he shot a terrible 44.1%. Regardless, his all-around impact to his team's historic success is a top 3 MVP season in my humble opinion. Number 2. Steph Curry in 2016. According to most lists, I have this season ranked much higher than others typically do, but I believe it was every bit as impactful as it needed to be to earn the title of the second greatest MVP season of all time. He was fantastic off ball, and his lethal perimeter shooting made all of his teammates better as his range helped spread the floor. On the season, Curry averaged 30.1 points, 6.7 assists, 5.4 rebounds, and 2.1 steals on 50.4% shooting. He also shot a ridiculous 45.4% from three-point range and a league-leading 90.8% from the free throw line, giving him the historic 50-40-90 season. It's also the only 50-40-90 season where the player led the entire league in scoring, which essentially makes this season the pinnacle of efficiency. He made a league record 402 three-pointers on the season, and up to that point, no one had ever made more than 300. To shoot 45.4% on that many three-point attempts is a level of sniping that no one else has ever come close to in the game's history. To put that in perspective, his three-point shooting percentage that season was greater than the career field goal percentage of all-time great scorers like Kobe Bryant, James Harden, and Carmelo Anthony. His unselfish personality and his off-ball movement was the perfect play style and leadership for that Warriors group, and he was the conduit to their historic 73-9 record, which was the greatest regular season of all time. He wasn't necessarily the greatest on-ball defender, but he certainly wasn't a liability, and he actually led all players in steals that season with his 2.1. He may have been on the greatest regular season team, and he was the only unanimous MVP the league has ever seen, but he'll have to settle for just the runner-up spot on this list. Number 1. Michael Jordan in 1988. It wouldn't be a championship year, but from an individual standpoint, Jordan was never better than he was in the 87-88 season. On the year, he put up an all-time great 35 points, 5.9 assists, 5.5 rebounds, 3.2 steals, and 1.6 blocks on 53.5% shooting. To average 35 points on 53.5% shooting is remarkable. To do that as a guard is absolutely insane. The thing about 88 MJ is that as good as he was on offense, he was just as good on defense. He was suffocating the opponent with his crowding on-ball defense. His 3.2 steals led the league that season, and is actually the 8th highest single-season average of all time. Despite being a guard, he was also 16th among all players in blocked shots. His total of 131 blocks on the season is still easily the highest amount of blocks by a guard in NBA history. This defensive effort earned him that season's Defensive Player of the Year award, and Jordan is still the only player to win the scoring title and the Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. With this GOAT season, Jordan carried his team to a 50-32 record, which was the 3rd seed in the Eastern Conference. The second highest scorer on the team was averaging barely a third of the points that Jordan was contributing. The next best players on Chicago at this point were probably Charles Oakley and Dave Corzine, which is very far from a Hall of Fame supporting cast. Essentially, this Chicago squad had absolutely no business winning 50 games or being a 3rd seed in a much stronger Eastern Conference. But when you have a GOAT MVP season like Jordan did, I guess anything is possible after all. At the time I'm making this video, Anthony Edwards just led his Minnesota Timberwolves to sweep the talented Phoenix Suns out of the first round of the playoffs. Without question, it was a team effort, as Minnesota is a well-rounded group, with a great scorer in Karl Anthony Towns, a perennial Defensive Player of the Year candidate in Rudy Gobert, and other solid veterans and defensive contributors. With that being said, there's zero question on who's the face of this team and the cornerstone of this franchise. Beyond the fact that Edwards is currently establishing himself as the best shooting guard in the entire league at just the young age of 22, he's also consistently drawing comparisons to the greatest icon in basketball history, Michael Jordan. Beyond the fact that there's some weird, far-fetched clues that Ant might just be Jordan's actual son, he resembles MJ in so many ways from a playstyle standpoint. Anytime someone is compared to MJ, it always seems like an unfair and lofty comparison. But seriously, just take time to consider how much they have in common when it comes to their game. Both play at the shooting guard position, and both have a fantastic handle of the basketball. Both players are incredible leapers and above-the-rim finishers. Both players were two-way threats, and each of them were arguably the best shot-blocking guard of their era. Both guys have a similar build, confidence, and demeanor, and both guys raise their game to the highest level in the postseason. Obviously, Edwards doesn't quite have the numbers or the accolades that MJ does, but he's only 22, and Michael Jordan turned 22 years old during his rookie season. At this point in his career, you can't deny the fact that he's extremely similar to Michael, both stylistically and in terms of his confidence. This guy has the potential to be the face of the league within the next couple of seasons, and at least for now, he seems to be the guy who most appropriately fits the title of the next Michael Jordan. In order to be given that mantle though, you can't just be a talented player, because there's many talented players throughout the league. You have to have that it factor. You have to have a personality and a charisma to back up that title. You have to be marketable and someone that grabs attention. As people younger than me would put it, you have to have that aura. To be the next Michael Jordan, you can't just have the talent, but you have to be capable of being a media darling, with mass appeal for general audiences. Without a shadow of a doubt, Ant has all of that, and the league is currently promoting him like it, as if he's being groomed to be the face of the league as LeBron is in his exit phase. I gotta be honest, I think many LeBron fans are in for a rude awakening when he retires, as they'll be finding out pretty quickly how the mainstream media machine works. For now, daily debates on ESPN and Fox Sports are about who's the GOAT, MJ or LeBron. But the thing is, there's an underlying theme to this topic that's usually never acknowledged. It's about one active player versus one retired player. It's about pitting the old fans versus the new fans. There's a reason why these segments are never debates between Michael Jordan and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, because that's two inactive players, or in stronger terms, two irrelevant players. Many players and analysts have asked why Kobe never seems to be a part of the debate anymore. And if you ask me, it's simply because the Mamba isn't around anymore. He was regularly a part of those debates when he was still active and he was still competing.
But to me, Kobe is there with Michael.
Kobe wound up as the greatest player of all time, better than MJ. There you go. Stage is yours.
Kobe Bryant's a better ball handler, a better shooter, and a better scorer in my opinion.
Game on the line. Kobe or Michael? Who do you want?
It's a coin toss. It really doesn't matter. I'm taking Kobe Bryant.
All right. That's all I'm asking.
Kobe Bryant.
These arguments and these discussions are going to be in sport for as long as there is sport. So the player may not enjoy it, but that's the enjoyment for a lot of people.
Stephen A., who's better at 33, Kobe or was MJ?
I think there has been nobody better than Kobe Bryant.
Yeah, I don't think I lose. Other than Kobe Bryant, because he steals all my moves.
But once he retired and LeBron was still active, the debate focused even more heavily on the old versus the new. Pretty soon, LeBron will be joining that group of old news, and the league and the mainstream media will be looking for the next active player to push the debates forward. And who better for that than the guy who literally looks like a mirror image of Michael Jordan? I guarantee that the NBA league office and the corporate media would love to see the Minnesota Timberwolves win a championship in the next couple of seasons. That way, they can officially usher in the new debate of the old versus the new. After all, MJ didn't win his first championship ring until he was 28 years old, and Edwards has got a shot at getting his first at the young age of 22. As you can see, the framework and the foundation is already there for the media. Now there just needs to be a couple dominoes falling the way they'd like to truly get the ball rolling.
It's one of the reasons that LeBron is so great. I refuse to get into the GOAT debate. I don't care. They didn't play against each other. I do not care. What makes him great, well, a bunch of things, but what has made him great is the fact that he's done it now for 21 years at the highest level. I think it's fair to just say there are different tiers of greatness. By the way, a lot of times we're comparing eras, we're comparing different rules, we're comparing the fact that, look, like I'll say this with Michael Jordan, and I don't mean this to be controversial, but like everybody talks about all these, the context of this era. Michael Jordan, the Dallas Mavericks were added as the 23rd team in 1981. Jordan was drafted. During his heyday, 6 teams were added to the NBA. There were 90 players added to the NBA Does that not water down? I'm not talking playoffs, by the way. No chance we're talking playoffs. Does that not water down the regular season to a degree? You lived it, right? You played against some of those teams. You played against the Bobcats. If we add 2 teams in 2 or 3 years, we get a Vegas franchise or a Seattle franchise, you're not telling me that the league for a little bit is going to be a little watered down?
Maybe, a little bit.
So as you just saw, JJ Redick is back at it again, dropping some of those controversial takes that are sure to rile people up, while literally claiming that he's not trying to be controversial. In this one clip, he mentioned that he doesn't care about the GOAT conversation at all. And then he immediately followed it up by taking a shot specifically at Jordan's era. As for myself personally, I no longer get frustrated with JJ's takes about old school eras, because to be completely honest, the shade is kind of expected at this point. After starting a podcast with LeBron James, and after the rumors swirling about the Lakers head coaching spot, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that JJ is saying things that supports his friend and his fellow podcaster. But the question is, with all of that being said, does the man have a point? Was the 90s actually a watered down era? And is that a legitimate criticism when looking at the GOAT debate? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, as I explain the details of how the expansion worked. Starting things off, let's look at the basics of how the league expanded. At the end of the 1987 to 1988 NBA season, there were 23 teams in the league. With the popularity of the game reaching record heights, the league office desired to expand their product and bring more NBA teams to more cities, which would naturally and dramatically increase revenue over time. Between the 88 to 89 season and the 95 to 96 season, the league added 6 more teams, which increased the total number of franchises to 29. Those teams were the Miami Heat and the Charlotte Hornets in 1988, the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Orlando Magic in 1989, and the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies in 1995. Now here's the thing, most people don't even understand how these teams were formulated. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't just picking up random water boys and semi-athletic fans out of the stands. But first and foremost, the expansion teams were able to pick players from the other 23 teams in the league. But obviously, they couldn't just pick any players that they wanted. Otherwise, an expansion team would become an overpowered super team in their first season. There were specific rules in place for the expansion draft, and the first one is that each pre-existing team in the league could protect up to 8 players on their roster, but after that, everyone else was up for grabs. The second major rule was that each team in the league would only give up 1 player in order to form the 2 expansion teams. Obviously, this wouldn't leave many immediate all-stars for the expansion teams to select, but they were able to get some quality pieces, like the famous enforcer Rick Mahorn, the prolific scorer Reggie Theus, and the NBA's record holder for the most assists in a single game, Scott Skiles. Now you can act like the Bulls dynasty always benefited from these expansions, but the truth is they were actually hurt by it in some instances. For example, BJ Armstrong was one of the best 3-point shooters in the entire league, and had just been an NBA All-Star the year prior. But because of the expansion draft in 1995, he was taken from the Bulls with the first overall pick, severely weakening the strength of Chicago's roster. So ultimately, an important detail to remember is that the expansion teams were made up of quality NBA players, and it was the responsibility of the other 23 teams, Bulls included, to then fill their roster spot, with either a player from the draft or through free agency. So now that we understand how the expansion teams were created, and that it wasn't just a collection of scrubs like JJ Redick makes it seem, it's time for me to make my next major point. Expansion teams typically don't stay awful for very long. The NBA is constructed in such a way where it's a league that tries to naturally maintain a competitive balance. Although expansion teams don't have many all-star level players in their first season, they do start accumulating top draft lottery picks rather quickly, thanks to their low seeding. And it's also worth mentioning that they usually have plenty of cap space to make moves in the offseason. Sure, the Charlotte Hornets began playing in the 88-89 season, but by the 92-93 season, they had a stacked roster, with stars like Alonzo Mourning, Larry Johnson, and Kendall Gill, and made it all the way to the Eastern Conference semifinals. The Miami Heat also began playing in the 88-89 season, but they were a playoff team by the 91-92 season, and by the 96-97 season, they were legitimate title contenders, who were stacked with all-stars, won 61 games, and made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals. Then you had the Orlando Magic and the Minnesota Timberwolves, who began playing in the 89-90 season. Yes, the Wolves were bad, and stayed bad for a long time. But at this point, I think we can tell that this was mostly because of bad management, and not necessarily because they were an expansion team. The Orlando Magic were able to get guys like Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway because of their low seeding, and by 1994, they were legitimate title contenders. They were the only team to eliminate Jordan's Bulls after they begun winning championships, and the Magic even went on to the NBA Finals in 1995. So what I just explained is that 3 out of those first 4 expansion teams were not only decent, but were extremely competitive within a few years. Before the Bulls even started their second three-peat, 3 out of those 4 teams were legitimate obstacles for Chicago. Now for the last 2 expansion teams, you have the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies, who began playing basketball in the 95-96 season. And yes, those 2 teams did stay awful throughout the entirety of the Bulls' second three-peat. So here's what you need to consider. In the 95-96 season, where the Bulls famously finished with a 72-10 record, the Grizzlies were in the West and the Raptors were in the East. In that record-breaking regular season, the Bulls had a 2-0 record against the Grizzlies and a 3-1 record against the Raptors. Now, if those expansion teams didn't exist, and those 5 victories were against regular NBA teams instead, then yeah, it's at least possible that the Bulls win less games, and maybe they finish with 69 or 70 wins instead of 72. But I mean, in order for that to happen, you have to assume that the Bulls would have had a 3-3 record against the average NBA team. And considering the fact that they went 67-9 against the rest of the league that season, I would say that that's a pretty big assumption. I think you guys are starting to see my point. The impact that the expansion era had on the Bulls dynasty is negligible when you understand the full context. If you were to go back in time in the summer of 1995 and you were to ask the Bulls management, would they rather keep their sharpshooter BJ Armstrong, or would they rather not have the Toronto Raptors standing in their path in the Eastern Conference? I think their answer would be rather obvious. Of course, they would rather keep their quality player. Now imagine, it's 1998, Michael Jordan just epically defeated the Utah Jazz with a 45-point performance in Game 6 of the NBA Finals to win his 6th championship and 6th Finals MVP. And in an interview, you get to tell MJ to his face that he's not the greatest player of all time because the Toronto Raptors and the Vancouver Grizzlies exist. Yeah, someone needs to tell JJ Redick that that's as ridiculous as it sounds.